thank you so much, everybody, for introducing yourself. And let me say, I'm really impressed at this amount of knowledge and experience and perspective that we have in this digital Zoom room. This is really amazing. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you also later during the discussion. Very briefly about me, I'm a PhD researcher at the Jagiellonian University, and I also am a researcher in a larger European funded research project on the rise of populism and the far right in Central and Eastern Europe. And yeah, I myself work at the intersection of political science and cultural studies, looking at the political culture of the populist far right in Germany. Yeah, but without further ado, let us turn to our speaker tonight, who is Daphne, who is already here with us and has listened, as I saw, very, very attentively to everybody's introductions. Yeah, I'm really glad. I'm really honored. Thank you so much for your invitation and for letting me introduce Daphne, who is, I would say, one of the already leading, especially female voices. We just briefly talked about it. Yeah, in this field of populism studies that is rising so much in Europe. Daphne is right now a full professor for comparative politics at the University of Reading, after getting, as far as I know, also all her degrees in the UK. And she has a special interest in party politics and voting behavior using quantitative methods. And I'm really looking forward to her sharing her insights in that. She has focused on, of course, on populism, the far right, and nationalism. So she will, I guess, really help us to understand how these intricate concepts interrelate, both in Greece, Europe, but also beyond Europe. And yeah, if you want to read more from Daphne, she has published in some of the major journals that are in the field. West European Politics, Journal Common Market Studies. She is editing Nations and Nationalism, so there's a lot out there. Daphne is also really present in the media, so that is also a good way how to hear more from her. Yeah, and from all the discussions that I had the pleasure already of hearing Daphne, I always really perceive her as a very critical and fresh voice in this discussion on populism. So I'm really looking forward. I will now turn over the word to you. You have around 1 hour, so until 7:15, something like that. Then we will take a break, and then we will have a discussion. Thank you so much.
That's super. Thank you so much, Sabine, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I was really also impressed to hear everybody's background and their interests. So I think there's also high expectations here. So I hope that I meet them. Just to add to what Sabine said just quickly about me, I think I sort of combine, if you like, different disciplines, because I came from the nationalism studies field, but I've also increasingly been working on comparative European political economy and also in the policy domain as well, sort of particular policies that may mitigate the risks that people face, so that may vote less for the far right populists, if you like. So there is a blend in what I am going to talk to you about today. And as Sabine said, I am quite quantitative and I have a lot of data to show you, but I will do that in very simple graphs, and I will just explain them really. So what I want to do, two things, and I will open my slides in a second, but I want to introduce and discuss the topic of populism, nationalism, and identity, but I want to do it from a critical lens, and I want to challenge some of maybe the dominant perspectives that we have. So I really want you to think. So I'm going to maybe disagree with things that you've heard, and I may challenge some of the key ideas that are out there, but I do that by sort of putting forward part of what is there in the literature, but also my own theory of populism, which I prefer to call the far right, and I will tell you shortly why. I will now share, that's right, share my screen. I will do it in a slideshow. If I was asking earlier about how much of the terminology you may have you may be familiar with already. So I'm not going to linger too much, but I will give you an overview as well. And if at any time, I know we're supposed to have a conversation at the end, but if at any time somebody's unclear about something that I'm saying, or wants to ask a question or anything, just please, Sabine, you can coordinate that. I'm sure you can have a little, if somebody puts up their hand, I'll be happy to stop and respond. So I've roughly an hour. What I want to do, I've been asked to talk about populism, nationalism, and identity. And what I want to do in this lecture is really two things. So first, I want to map the phenomenon that we're talking about. What is this populism? How does it interact with nationalism and identity? But I also want to see how well it's doing. I'm going to focus on Europe. I know a lot of you have already talked a bit about Latin America and Australia, really interesting. And then maybe even in the discussion, we can see to the extent to which I think these ideas can also be applied, because I do wonder, and that's another thing I may challenge, I do wonder how comparable this is beyond particular. So there is a generalizability, but how generalizable is it? Are we talking really about the same thing when we're talking about Trump and when we're talking about, I don't know, the Swiss People's Party? Is it the same phenomenon? So I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to map the electoral performance of these parties in Europe mainly, because that's what I work on, and just very briefly go over some definitions, but in a challenging way. And then second and most importantly, I want to focus my talk on the causes of this phenomenon by looking at three levels of analysis: the demand, i.e. the people who vote for them or who support them; the supply, i.e. the political parties, the rhetoric, what they do to appeal to the people; and the policy level. And really my argument in a nutshell is the following, is that nationalism and identity are not really demand side drivers, but they are more supply side drivers. So I think in sort of a combination of my work, I will show that contrary perhaps to some of the theories that suggest that this phenomenon is driven predominantly by value shifts, I want to argue that there remain two dimensions of contestation. The economy also matters in terms of demand, but in terms of supply, what these parties are doing is that they're employing a rhetoric that is fundamentally based on nationalism. At the policy level, there are social policies that can actually mitigate the risks that drive and secure people to vote for the far right. So this is a coherent sort of whole presentation of my argument. This really collages all the different work, research that I have done on the topic, and feel free to disagree at any point if you would like. So what are we talking about? I know so many of you so interested and in so many different countries, and it's a big buzzword, isn't it? Populism. This is an article from The Guardian from, I think now a couple of years ago, where they did this exclusive big sort of new populism special feature. And it turned out apparently 1 in 4 Europeans vote populism. And surely, if you think about it, we've been hearing about this word more and more and more. There is something going on. Populist parties are really on the rise, not only in Europe, but everywhere. Okay, and if, again, this is also from The Guardian, mapping far left populists and far right populists from sort of the late 1990s to the late 2010s. And again, what it shows here is that it's not just populism, but actually it's most importantly far right populism that is really getting all the votes. When we say far right populism, I'll go in a minute, but I guess we're talking about some kind of populism that links to nationalism, right? So it seems that the combination of populism and nationalism is really a winning formula for many leaders, parties, etc., etc., at least across Europe. and I have some objections with that broad categorization that I'll go in a minute, but the story sort of goes along the lines of, this is a kind of linear phenomenon. So I've got the 2017 elections here for a reason. There are many different elections that took place in different European countries in 2017. So they're a lovely comparison because they're national elections, but they just took place in many cases. And what we can see here, what I've done in the simple graph, I just basically show you how some of these parties did in 2017 vis-a-vis the previous national election in the same country. And it's just a selection of different European countries from both Eastern and Western Europe. And what it does show you is that in many cases, the far right increased, the far right populism, if you like, increased quite a lot. So we heard a lot about the Front, now Rassemblement National, but formerly Front National, how it made it to the second round of the French presidential election, and how many of these parties have actually been part of coalition governments. So in Norway, but also later in Italy, also in Austria, right? So I guess the point is not simply that we've heard a lot about these far-right populists winning, or not winning, but becoming serious contenders in elections, but also them participating in government coalitions. Now, you might look at this graph and tell me, but look at UKIP. UKIP actually is one of the few parties that did really poorly. And then I guess the response will be, yeah, because the sort of right-wing nationalist agenda of UKIP to exit the EU was taken up nicely by the mainstream. And so they implemented it really successfully. And so why would you have UKIP if you have other parties that are more legitimate, if you like, and can be can basically implement the same kind of ideas. So really, this tells us we have two things here. We have parties doing well in elections, but we also have parties of right-wing, far-right populist parties, however you want to call them, sort of infiltrate mainstream ground, permeate mainstream ground, and kind of the ball is in their turf, if you like. The party competition really takes place in their turf, and that is something that we really have seen in the past 5 years. But more recently, maybe they're not all doing so well. So I remember someone in the audience was working on Germany, I think. The AfD is a bit tricky now, isn't it? It's doing quite well, but in some of the regional elections, it's been declining. There is a bit of a rally around the flag effect going on in after the pandemic. So in some countries, you might have seen the very latest results from the regional elections in France, where Marine Le Pen didn't make the breakthrough that she was hoping to make. And obviously there's been the corruption issue with the FPÖ in Austria. Also in Greece, my country, which that was a bit of an embarrassing moment to see these Nazis get representation in our parliament, but they're in prison now for murder, grievous bodily harm, and maintaining a criminal organization, and they have completely imploded and they're no longer in parliament. So there might be, as we progress, a more varied picture, and I've always emphasize that. And I think another thing to say here is, and I'll show you I'll show you here the bigger picture. This is from the Armin John database. Again, it's a nice simple graph, but it shows you how far-right parties across Europe have fared in the past 40, 50 years. And I'll be interested if you want to pick up on the discussion. But what I see looking at this graph is I see more variation than a linear effect, right? I see something really happened in the mid 1980s. Before that, we have these parties, really marginalized, probably the effect of the Second World War and the sort of, really Nazi kind of politics being marginalized completely. Then you have a rise around sort of 1990, and then you have some fluctuations, right? And I think what I'm not showing in this graph, but again, would be interesting to talk about afterwards, is that there is not only variation across time, but there's also variation within countries. So if you are interested, and I think it's in some of the materials that I assigned for you to take a look at, you can see that even within a country, you have some far-right parties or populist far-right parties that are successful vis-a-vis some that are not. Greece, Golden Dawn went really well, Laos declined. In Austria, the FPO doing really well, but the BZÖ declining. In Germany, the AfD really well, but the NPD not really well at all, right? So there are variations, a lot to do with discourse, as we'll see later, but also a lot to do with the demand side dynamics. So why am I telling you all this? Just to situate, I haven't even started really yet, right? I'm just situating the phenomenon we're talking about in the bigger picture. And I think the bigger picture is, yes, there has been a rise in this type of politics, but I think we should also take that with a bit of a pinch of salt. So that rise is not new. After all, the FPO was also in a coalition government in late 1990s. After all, the List Pim Fortuin did really well in the Netherlands in the early 2000s. After all, Laos joined a coalition government in Greece before the economic crisis. So it's not necessarily a new phenomenon. However, there has been a sort of a proliferation. This is also a supply side thing, right? In the way that the media portrays these parties as legitimate actors. And so I think maybe what is different is the lifting of the cordon sanitaire in many cases. So the idea that these parties now call party competition and that it's okay to imitate them. So what has changed in my view is that a lot of other mainstream parties think that in order to defeat these parties, they need to become these parties. And so we're seeing an increase in anti-immigration narratives, nationalist narratives, populist narratives across the board, right? And I've been in also quite a few policy discussions among the left, where it's having its own identity crisis, and it's imploding in many countries as well. And the discussion is very much, should we become really populist too in order to defeat this populism? So I think this is one key takeaway. But before I delve into why this has happened, let me very quickly, I know that you've had quite a lot of sessions and you may have heard this before, so I'll do it in a bit of a challenging way and maybe do it less, not take as much time. But so in a nutshell, you will, let me start differently. I started working on this long before it was popular. So I did my PhD, finished it in 2007, and it was on nationalism and religion, actually. And then I started working, what really always interested me, both from an academic but also a personal perspective, is why people do extreme things. I want to know why. I find it fascinating why in society some people go for the extremist line. Now, whether that is in terms of using violence or whether that is committing crimes, and in the political science setting, that is why they would opt for a party that is obviously outside systemic policies, why they were politics, right? So when I started working on this phenomenon, writing articles back in sort of 2011, 2010, it was called the extreme right. Nobody really talked about populism. And when this became a bit more popular, I dug up this article that I'm not sure if you've covered in your program, on a conference that took place at the London School of Economics in 1969, featuring people like Ernest Gellner, Isaiah Berlin, on populism. I think there is a government and opposition publication of it. And they talk about the rise of populism. And if you read the article, they're talking about something completely different. They're talking about the context of the Cold War, and they're talking about the communist bloc. And so again, they're talking about something that's out of the system, something that's popular and attracting sort of, anti-systemic views, but not what we're talking about today. And so I think it's more challenging to delineate the actual dependent variable, if you like, or the actual unit of analysis that we have, because what we are ending up, I fear, in my discipline, is just calling everything that we don't like populism. So any party that is a bit anti-system, populism. Every party that might be a bit violent, whatever, populism. But take that as well with a pinch of salt, because I do wonder whether that is particularly helpful. So I think in any case, what the far, and there is also a, I will delve into that a bit later. There is also, I think, a counterfactual reasoning problem with the study of populism. Now, what do I mean about that? I think that part of the problem in defining populism is also that because we tend to see it as everything, every party that we don't like is populism, there is sort of not a counterfactual to it anymore. It's very difficult to understand what is not populism, you know? So Brexit is populist, and the far right is populist, and the far left is populist, but also the mainstream can be populist. But the category in itself can't be meaningful analytically for us to understand how to address it if there isn't something that isn't populism, right? For a category to exist, you have to have a category that is outside this category. And this is a conceptual problem that populism has. And I think for this reason, I prefer to use the term far right to denote these parties, or particularly far right populism, if you like to add the word populism, because I think that that allows us to make more meaningful analytical distinctions between different political parties so that we can study them. So when I say the far right, which, as I said, by many others is right-wing populists, I really mean something very similar, but essentially what I mean is a political party that basically draws on dichotomies. So it blends populism and nationalism in that it draws on the dichotomy between the in-group and the out-group. And that in-group and out-group is both defined by the nation. So we are, we are members of the national unit, and therefore everybody outside it cannot belong. But we are also members of the popular unit. So the people are good. So the national people, the people who belong in the national group are the good thing. And then the non-people, the elite, and those who don't belong to the national group are sort of the bad thing, right? They need to be excluded. So there is the very well-known, and I'm sure you've heard it in many of your other lectures, definition of the far right or the radical right, I think initially by Casmude, that includes nativism, populism, and authoritarianism. And I, in my own work, have basically defined actually these parties as parties that propose nationalist solutions to all socioeconomic problems. So in my definition, I guess what I'm saying is that the way to know a far-right populist party from a non-far-right populist party is that these parties don't only talk about nationalism, because many others talk about nationalism. The Tories talk about nationalism. The left talks about nationalism, right? One nation Labour even, right? So there is a lot of nationalism in other parties. But what the far right does in particular is that it proposes that nationalist policies are a solution to every problem. So is your problem my local NHS is not working, National Health Service for those who are not in the UK, my local health provider isn't working well. Nationalist solution, get rid of immigrants. Is my problem, the schools in my area are not really good, but great, get rid of immigrants. What about I don't have access to jobs, there's a lot high unemployment in my region, no problem, get rid of immigrants. I think this is what distinguishes a far-right populist party from all other parties, is that the solution to every problem you might have is a nationalist solution. So, and as we'll see a bit later, and here we delve into the nationalism, I think that nationalism tends to be taken for granted in populism studies a bit, right? So everybody will agree that nationalism is a defining feature of the far right, but they're not really going to explain so much what that means. We know it's an in-group and out-group distinction. As I said earlier, we in the in-group don't want the out-group. But there are finer grained distinctions to be made between who is the in-group and who is the out-group. And again, where my research is different, and I'll show that later with some of the nationalist rhetoric that these parties are employing, usually there is this distinction between nativism and nationalism. So nativism is supposed to be this narrower form of nationalism that defines people in terms of, for example, common birth or common descent. But what I am arguing here is that actually what has made these parties successful is their employment of a broader civic form of nationalism, which we tend in the literature to understand as the good form, right? The more inclusive form. the form, the patriotic form, the form that anybody can gain access easier to the nation, right? That's what civic nationalism is, because you don't have to be born in it. You can just do a citizenship test, right? And you can just be in the country for 5 years and you get it. And that's so civic nationalism is defined by institutions, by things that you can gain, not by things that you were born with. And so in my argument, as you'll see later on, this is actually the kind of nationalism that has propelled these parties to first and second place by making them appear more legitimate and more moderate, whereas in fact they're actually not moderate. So as I said, what these parties really are doing is that they're blending this nationalism, and I'm not narrowing it down to nativism, but I'm broadening it to civic and ethnic nationalism, and they're blending this with something you already heard a lot in this program, I'm sure, so I won't talk about it too much, but this distinction between us, the people, versus them, the corrupt elite. Just for your information, something that I also find very interesting, but I've heard less in the study of populism is Riker's perspective. So we hear a lot about the ideational approach. I'm sure you've heard it, and a lot of these questions about whether whether populism is an ideology or populism is a discursive style. But Riker, in a book written long ago, before the hype, actually argues that it's neither, in a way that what populism really is essentially a vision of how to make collective decisions in society. So what it does is it basically tells you that the only legitimate and correct way to make decisions in society is through the will of the people. So through basically the bottom. So any top-up decisions, the representative government and the parliament and all that, by extension, are not legit. The only way to make these decisions are from the bottom. So referenda, really, these are the only legitimate ways. So what populism really does is it tells you this is how we should make collective decisions, and any other way is not legitimate for us. And I think that's a really interesting take, because it tells us a lot about how populism in this sense what this might mean rather for democratic politics, and the discussion that I'm sure you've had, and it's not part of my lecture, but might be of interest to you, the discussion between whether populism is a corrective or a threat to democratic politics. And I think that through this perspective, it's probably more a threat and less a corrective, but that's for later. So in a nutshell, before I go into the why, if you have the far-right party family or the far-right populist party family, I think what makes a lot of sense here, drawing on the different types of understanding of the people and the different types of understanding of the nation, just to simply divide these parties between the extreme variants and the radical variants. So you have the extreme variants like the Greek Golden Dawn, with the Nazi salutes and their swastikas. These are more the extreme variants, and you don't really expect to see these parties in contemporary democratic systems. They're not the norm. They haven't been doing well at all in most cases. Germany, for example, many others, but they have done really well in some cases like Greece, or also in Eastern Europe. So, for example, Jobbik was an example of that, but again, it's now changed. There is a discussion as to whether the extreme version is populist. There is an argument, and there's some literature that argues that it isn't. I would argue that if any of these parties are populist, it is the extreme. They are the quintessential populism, and the reason for that is because they are really the Nazi party. I mean, if you study Nazism or fascism at all, you will see that one of the key features of fascism is populism, precisely because it claims to derive its authority from the people. Fascism is quintessentially a bottom-up, purportedly, not in reality, but purportedly a bottom-up ideology that essentially tells you that really the fascist regime embodies the people. So if you look at literature, Michael Mann or Juan Linz or a lot of others that have written on fascism, you will see that populism is a key feature. So I think the Golden Dawn, for example, and we did a lot of work on its both its online materials, but also its manifestos, they had very much this idea that, you know, the Golden Dawn leader comes from the people. He doesn't represent the people, he embodies the Greek people who need to shed off these awful elites that are now ruling us and basically go back to this popular collective decision making, which in reality would be the Golden Dawn leader, obviously, on top and nobody else having a say. But this is the idea. But anyway, these parties are very rare, at least in terms of electoral success. Whereas the radical right variants, these are the ones that I will argue later have adopted a civic form of nationalism, are the ones that have done really, really well in Europe. And most of the parties I showed you are exactly these parties, starting from, I don't know, the Dutch Freedom Party, to the there's so many, the Rassemblement National, how it's tried to moderate its rhetoric, etc., the Swiss People's Party, etc., etc. So why? I think this is why, this is the moment, half an hour later, the moment is here. Why is this happening? And does that have to do much with much at all with nationalism? Very briefly, this is the context. Again, I know you've probably been shown this at some other of your lectures, but really there are two levels, right? Why is this going on? Either because something changes in society, something has changed, and people's preferences are now supporting these parties. This is the one option, right? So something happens at the demand level. Or it's actually a supply side thing. People are now convinced by political parties that they should be opting for them, right? So people are malleable, they're volatile, and therefore the parties are doing something really catchy, they're doing something really successful, and that makes people vote for them. And sort of the truth is always somewhere in the middle. So the demand and supply side frameworks are somehow mutually complementary, right? So changes in voter preferences also have to do with changing in party rhetoric and vice versa. So it's really very difficult to understand demand without supply or supply without demand. I mean, I think one thing again to think about that I find fascinating is that the variation that I talked about at in the beginning is interesting vis-a-vis a demand side perspective, because we do have many countries that have discontent voters, but not a successful far-right party. At least we used to. So I used to, a couple of years ago, bring this wonderful example that doesn't work anymore between Greece, Spain, and Portugal. And I even wrote an article, and you know, it's all about how Greece had the Golden Dawn, whereas Portugal and Spain, who also were bailed out and also had an economic crisis, didn't have a far-right populist party. So clearly, I mean, you know, surely there are people who don't like immigrants in Spain. Yes, and now they vote for Vox. Surely there are people who are discontent and angry at the establishment in Portugal. Now they vote for Chega. Why didn't they vote for similar parties 5 years ago, right? So this is to show you that the demand and supply side levels complement each other. There might be a demand, latent demand, but if there isn't a catchy supply, these voters will go for something else. So this is a very complex interplay. But let me start with the demand. And this is the heart of the issue. So if you started, you know, what has been going on at the societal level? Why are people really voting for nationalists? A lot of the discussion now is surrounding this so-called cultural backlash. So I'm sure that you've seen it everywhere. You've seen The Economist, that was part of the cover of my talk. The Economist's sort of cover, the new nationalism. So this phenomenon is accompanied by some kind of value shift, right? So societies used to be divided by the haves and have-nots. So people used to care about how much money comes in their pocket, but apparently they don't care about that anymore at all. But what they really care about is the erosion of their cultural identity, right? So this is a sort of a value shift that happens in affluent societies, really, right? So now we're all a big happy middle class. So we're not really that concerned about economics, but we're really concerned about immigrants. We are really concerned about cultural. We are culturally insecure because we fear that these foreigners with their foreign ideas, or maybe, you know, their different norms and practices, they will come in our country and they will erode our national values. This is the so-called, roughly in a nutshell, how it goes. How do we know empirically that this is true? Well, the studies that emphasize this kind of rationale focus on things like, we know because immigration is a strong driver of far-right populist party support. So those who support far-right populists tend to have anti-immigrant attitudes. We also know because these people tend to have authoritarian values. We know because there is identification in surveys across the TAN sort of dimension of the Galtan axis. We know that things like post material values matter for people. This is the argument. And so I'll show you what I want to show you here is that I think that's partially the case, but not fully. And I will show you why not with evidence. And so what I want to say here is, I think indeed in post-material societies, or at least affluent societies, post-material values matter, but they matter in combination with material values. How do I know this? I know this because first in my own work, and I'll show you, I think that it's hugely problematic to operationalize, or if you want in simpler terms, to understand immigration as a cultural issue. So if the argument says, but you know, those who don't like immigrants vote for the populist far right, therefore it's a nationalist problem, it's a cultural problem, I disagree, because there's a lot of people who don't like immigrants for material reasons. There is also a very strong trust dimension going on. So the far-right populism is also really linked, and again, I'll show you that with data, is also really linked to the question of lack of trust in institutions. The more that our trust in institutions declines, we're more likely to vote for the far right. So I think that what is going on there is a broader picture of protest and discontent, some of which is nationalist and some of which is not. But at the party level, as I said, I will show later, these parties have been really clever, you know, because they learn too. They're live actors, and they have learned that if you follow this sort of really hardcore sort of Nazi approach, you don't look legitimate anymore. There was a cordon sanitaire, nobody's going to vote for you. So how do you appeal to everybody who's discontent? How do you appeal to the person who's really angry because they feel the mainstream, I don't know, failed them because they didn't create a local playground in their area, versus the other person who might be really annoyed because he lost his job, versus another person who doesn't like immigrants? Well, they put this nice civic nationalist narrative in place that sort of is catchy for everybody. And then at the policy level, and I think there was someone in the audience, this might be interesting for you, and I'll show you this in a minute. Well, you know, it's not so much the nationalist policies, I think, but it's actually the inequality policies that matter more in mitigating the insecurities that drive people to these parties. So let's look at the individual grievances for a second. So as I said, you know, we have this post-material cleavage, prominence of cultural grievances, but this doesn't take into account that immigration is multidimensional. And there is a second thing that I've been working on that I want to share with you. I've been working on quite recently, which is not just about the propensity of an individual to vote for something, but it's also the size of the group that votes for them, right? So when I see in the polls, I see a party getting 35% of the vote, that simply cannot be all the racists, right? It's not possible. You don't have that, right? So something else is going on. What really has happened is that these parties we need to understand the support for these parties in terms of the size of the different groups that votes for them. Yes, there are racist people who vote for them, but they're rather small in numbers. The bigger numbers are the protesters, the angry voters who vote for them, not because they're worried about immigrants, but actually because they're just angry or because they have economic problems, and they all vote for them. And so you have different layers of different voters, core, i.e. the nationalists, and peripheral, i.e. the protest voters. Let me show you this with some graphs. Don't panic. It's a simple graph. So this is from our own work. What we did here, this is using European social survey data. So this is for across the Europe, across Europe and the UK included. This tells you a very simple thing. It tells you, it distinguishes between people who are, this is about immigration. So it tells you things about people who are concerned about the cultural impact of immigration versus the people who are concerned about the economic impact of immigration. The blue line on the top is those who believe that immigration is dire for your country's culture. It's the worst thing ever. Like if you bring immigrants in, your country's culture will be eroded terribly. Even their propensity to vote for the populist far right increases significantly if they also feel that these people are a threat to the economy. So unless you think that the immigrants are also an economic threat, then you really won't be that likely to vote for the far right. So this is to show that immigration is really a multidimensional issue, not just a nationalist issue. Here, what I've done is a simple thing just to show you the size. So if you like, I call these voters the nationalists or the culturalists. They're the ones who are worried about the cultural impact of immigration. And then the materialists are the ones that are worried about the economic impact of immigration. Look here, the percentage. So on the left, we have economy. On the right, we have culture. Because the likelihood is really strong of the person who dislikes cultural impact of immigration to vote for the far right, if you look at the red is the percentage. There's a higher percentage, right? It translates into a higher percentage of people voting for the far right if they are culturally insecure. But if you look at the numbers on the top red, actually the ones concerned about the economy are a larger group. Okay, so the people who have, so numerically speaking, without them, the party can't be successful in the national arena, as successful. This is only from one snapshot year, so we actually have better data for across the different ESS. But it just makes the simple point, if you want, you can envisage it like this, right? So essentially what I'm saying is once your propensity to vote for a political party doesn't equate that this party is going to have a large mobilization base. You need to make the distinction between galvanizing a core support and mobilizing broadly outside a support, right? So there is a composition effect that I think we're not looking at, and that composition effect tells us that there are a lot of people who have economic and trust related grievances that actually vote for these parties. I've got just here an example with little people. It just basically tells you, look at that, you can have loads and loads of people that are economically insecure, but they only constitute 10% of the party's electorate. And then you only have very few people who are culturally insecure, but they constitute 50% of the party's electorate, right? So composition, size matters, and it's very important in understanding why a party would actually become big enough to get the percentages that we saw earlier in this lecture, these 25 and 35 and 15%, right? This shows it to you. Also, this is from an article that I did quite recently. It shows you this in different European countries. You can see the different combinations here. I know it's a bit difficult because it's in the grayscale, but it shows you in the different countries the combination of the different concerns over immigration. And you can see that for a party to get those countries that have the most successful parties are the ones that have the combination of them both. Without the economic drivers, it's really difficult to actually get the big numbers that we are talking about. I can happily return to this later. And this is just something else to end with, something else to think about. This is from the 2016, so it's not the latest wave. It's from 2016, but this tells you, simply speaking, that there is a roughly 30%, 1/3 of far-right populist voters that don't care about immigrants at all. They don't have immigration-related concerns. 1/3 of these voters do not have nationalist, in other words, if you want to translate it like that, concerns. So these are definitely the protesters. There are people who vote for these parties for different reasons than simply. What could be these different reasons? Trust. So another way to think about this is to understand this economy versus culture, this sort of, whole, it's all about identity, as a totally false dichotomy, right? It's very difficult to distinguish between, as I showed you earlier, the economic people's, economic concerns from people, cultural concerns. And there's also a question of what is the profile, right? Who is this person? Why are particular people so, why do they hold a particular value, world value, or view of the world? Why do they have these values? Doesn't it have to do with their socioeconomic background? Does it have to do with where they were raised, what kind of schools they went in, what kind of family, what type of values their family upholds, right? So it's not easy to distinguish between these. And I think in another dimension of my work, I've discussed this concept of the social contract, which is to try and see all these issues, immigration, institutions, trust, to see them more as a question of, the social contract, as citizens and the state come together in a mutually beneficial relationship, if you like, where they both have expectations of the other. When the citizen perceives that somehow the state has breached its social contract obligations, whether because, as I said earlier, their local health service doesn't work, or because they're unemployed, or because there is a crisis and they're not getting the right benefits, or because they're insecure, then somehow they go for something extreme. They go for something radical. They go for something that's outside the mainstream that they have been voting for in the past. Super interesting finding maybe to discuss about nationalism is that we ran it in a recent paper, and we found a very interesting result that I will summarize, that is shown in this graph. We looked at different institutional different dimensions of social contract and trust. So trust in institutions, if people believe that the institutions in their country are effective, how well they believe that the state of education in their country is, and how well they believe the state of health in their country is. Among the general population, declining trust meant more support for populist far-right protesters, right? People are angry. They are the peripheral voter base that I showed you earlier. But look at the top gray line. These are the people who hate immigrants. These are the people for whom immigrants are, they don't like them on principle. They're not protest voters. They just do not, they have this worldview that does not like the outgroup. Their propensity to vote for the far right increases. Isn't that strange? So there is a nationalist story going on there with trust, but that story has to do with, for example, how if you feel there is a chauvinist nationalist story, if you like. So for those core voters who really dislike, who are nationalists, who dislike immigrants on principle, they want to keep their welfare state, and they want to keep the collective goods of the state for them. So the more they believe they are threatened, then that will respond in terms of how they vote for the far right or far right populace. So essentially what you have is diverging. If institutions increase their performance, the general population will stop voting for the far right, but then the core voters will vote for the far right even more. The better your institutions, the more you want to keep them for yourself and your in-group. So I think this is a very interesting way of looking at it. So this covers really the demand element of what I'm saying. So I guess what I'm trying to say is here, in a nutshell, there's a cultural nationalist story going on among core voters, but that is not the whole story. There are a whole load of other far-right populist voters that are not driven by nationalist concerns. And so I think that we can understand this phenomenon better if we make the distinction between galvanizing this core, i.e. they'll vote for the far right regardless, right? They'll vote for the far right, whatever, and mobilizing a broader public. And mobilizing this broader public also has important economic dimension, and I'll show you that in the policies in a minute. But let's go into the supply, because I know I've got maybe about 15 more minutes or so. But let's go into the supply side a second. So this was the demand. You have a latent support. You have a lot of people that could potentially vote for you if you're a populist far-right party, either because they're nationalists or because they're materialists or because simply they're angry and they've lost trust in the institutions. So what do? Do you just employ a narrative that distinguishes between us and them and that solves the problem? And I think that's not it either. I think that's also half the picture. This is also from The Guardian, came out recently, and it basically showed you they did this whole thing about populism and nationalism. And here we can also talk about measurement issues, etc. But essentially here they're telling you that the populist views, if that's even a thing, are declining, right? So that there are actually fewer people who believe that the power of few special interests prevents our country from making progress. However, the support for these parties has not necessarily declined. It has in some places, but not in others. So I'm not so sure whether this picture here coincides with the electoral picture of far-right populism that we actually have. And I think that the reason for this is that I think is because populism is a very useful descriptor of what these parties say, but it's not a useful analytical tool that explains to us why these people are getting voted for. So in other words, I don't think that people are voting for these parties because they are populist. I think the people are voting for the parties because they are nationalist. Look at this in contrast. This is also my work, and this is from work that I have done using the Comparative Manifesto project, which, for those who don't know, just basically maps the manifestos of political parties along certain issues. What it shows you is that the topic of nationalism has increased in terms of its salience among European party systems across the board. Simple English, European political parties are talking about nationalism a lot, okay, in their manifestos. This is what this shows you. Look at the sharp increase sort of around 2019, right? Or no, probably around 2017, 2018, when I showed you. Parties started talking a ton about nationalism. So there is something in this distinction, and it's not only the far-right populists, but it's actually across the board that it is increasing. But if we go, I'll show you some fun pictures now. If we go in detail and look a little bit at these parties, who are they? These parties that have been doing really, really well, we will see that it's a particular type, as I said. So if we look across the board, we look at parties that salute in a Nazi way, and you know, how many can you name? I know you're probably thinking now, if this was a face-to-face, I'd make this interactive and ask you, but you probably think, how many can you think? Golden Dawn, Jobbik, maybe another couple of Eastern European parties. That's it. How are they doing electorally? Not so well. What do the ones that are successful electorally do? They tell you, they use this different, they tell you things like the AFD in this really interesting campaign. You know, what were they saying here? They're basically stressing a kind of a cultural liberalism, right? So they are really just reshaping the boundaries of toleration in the rhetoric. That's what they're doing, using nationalism to do it. So here the AFD is telling you, why can't we walk around, you know, we are Western Europeans. Why can't we walk around in our bikinis? Why do we have to have these people in their burqas and covering themselves or whatever, right? Why can't we just walk around in our bikinis? The campaign was really big. If you, probably while you're listening, you can actually Google it if you're not already familiar with it. The AFD 2017 electoral campaign, they had a lot of these. They had their one with a little pig, why can't we eat pork? And then, so it's generally this liberal cultural idea, I also find it striking, and I have to say, many years ago now that I wrote a paper on this, and I was doing some research, I looked at the Swiss People's Party, the SVP manifesto, and to my great surprise, the manifesto started with a misquotation of Karl Popper on toleration. So the actual manifesto started with a quote saying, why should the tolerant be tolerant of those who would be intolerant of us if they were in our position? And I think this really, really beautifully sums up exactly the boundaries of toleration that I'm talking about, and exactly the way that these parties are trying. Basically, what they're saying is, not so implicitly, more explicitly, is we are liberal, democratic Western nations. We espouse freedom. We espouse liberty. Those people who come in and tell us we can't eat pork, or we can't drink wine, or we have to wear burqas or whatever, they are intolerant. And so we are not racist, you know, we are not ethnic nationalists, i.e. nativists, we are not intolerant. We just don't tolerate those who do not share our liberal democratic values. And the big problem is that this kind of rhetoric is so much more palatable, right? So if somebody comes and tells you, I admire Hitler and I like the swastika and I don't mind that he annihilated 6 million people systematically, you're probably thinking, no thanks, and that's a bit on the extreme side. But if they tailor this in terms of our in-group is really liberal and free, don't you love living in our free country? But so therefore we must keep it free. That is a much more difficult narrative to shed. Again, you may have seen another really interesting campaign has been was with the minarets. I don't know, the Front National did it a few years ago, and I think some others. They had this the country's flag with minarets coming up as missiles. So essentially, the idea was very sort of anti. That's why these countries, these parties are so anti-Islam. They try to portray Islam as really illiberal. So that's what they were doing. The minarets were missiles, so they were really threatening. And then there was the campaign, another really interesting campaign, the black sheep, white sheep campaign that the Swiss SPP had, where they have the Swiss flag. You might Google it again, and they had loads of happy Swiss white sheep grazing on the flag, and then they had the black sheep that was being kicked out by the white sheep. But the way that they presented this wasn't, we kick out the black one because it's racially different. They gave it the connotation of the deviant sheep, the criminal sheep, right? So the black one is criminal and it doesn't fit in our value consensus, right? So and they do this on the right. What I have here, I think this one is from the Front National. It's again part of the Comparative Manifesto project. They do this cultural campaign, which they fit in with a more welfarist, chauvinistic agenda. So they say, look, this outgroup is not only intolerant in terms of its cultural beliefs, but they're also scroungers. They want to come in and they want to take our. So they've become increasingly, they've shed sort of, you know, the classic liberal economic agenda that they had back in the day. They've moved that closer towards welfare chauvinism. Let's keep our collective goods of the states for us. So you must have seen as well the very famous UKIP poster drawing on the BNP, British jobs for British workers. And you might remember they had this massively long queue of people who looked ethnically different. All of them were somehow sort of culturally diverse, and they were also portrayed as these really threatening people who wanted to come in and take our culture, take our welfare state, take our jobs. Unemployment, immigration equals unemployment. That was a very famous Front National or Rassemblement National kind of rhetoric. So why am I telling you this? So here is how I conceptualize the relationship between populism and nationalism in the supply side. So I think essentially what this graph tells you is that populism is neither necessary nor sufficient as a driver of these parties, right? So you can be, you may be populist and be nationalist, and then what really matters is whether you're civic or ethnic nationalist. The civic nationalists will win, but then you may not be populist, okay? You may not talk so much about the people, in your narrative, but still, if you are employing the civic nationalist narrative that I said earlier, this cultural liberalism plus welfare, culture plus welfare sort of winning formula, you're still going to get the votes. So in a way, populism, I'll say again, I think is more useful as a descriptor of the party, but not necessarily as a driver of the party. So key takeaway from the supply side, what is the new winning formula? The new winning formula is a party that can appeal to both core and peripheral voters. So this kind of party uses a more moderate nationalist rhetoric that tries to also bring in the discontent with institutions, the discontent with the economy. Now, what does this mean for people who want to do something about this phenomenon? How do we stop it? How do we halt it? I was asked very recently to write a feature article for the Fabian Review, which is sort of, you know, the Labour Party's sort of main magazine or whatever, or linked to it, about what the left can do to stop far-right populism. And I thought, well, that's kind of the million-dollar question, isn't it? If we knew, yeah, you wouldn't be asking me. So there is a serious policy dimension, and I think part of the problem in reality of equating far-right populism to culture alone means that in policy terms, people are thinking that in order to defeat these parties, we need to become populist and anti-immigrant. We need to stop talking about the economy, and we need to start talking about culture. And so in practice, that has meant that even that a lot of the center-right, for the center-right, it's much easier to adapt to these narratives, right? But even some of the center-left has started talking a lot about immigration, a lot about how to stop this cultural, you know, this, however you want to call it, cultural opening or globalization, however you want to call it, halt it, and somehow, therefore, to mimic, to stop far-right populism by mimicking far-right populism. And I think, in a way, what my research has done, and what I've tried to show you here today, is that this is not the right way of going about it, because there are still, I think, you know, there are still some important inequalities that need to be, long-term inequalities that need to be addressed in order to stop the insecure periphery from voting for the far right. And I will show you this now with, again, a little bit of data by focusing on the extent to which certain social policies are able to limit or lower far right party support or reduce the likelihood of individuals exposed to high risks voting for the far right. So again, this is a simple graph. This is from something I wrote a few years ago. It just basically tells you very simply, this is looking at European Parliament elections. And it just tells you the simple thing that among the unemployed, so let's take the insecure group in itself, it just basically tells you that among the unemployed in countries where unemployment is high, if there is some kind of unemployment policy in place that secures these people are less likely to vote for the far right, simply speaking. So we know, and this is important because we do know that at the demand side level, and you might have seen that in some of the other lectures that you've had today, we know that the unemployed are a core support group, and the low income, so manual workers, unemployed workers, low income, insecure workers are still a core supporting constituency of the far right. And here you see the same in national elections since 1991. So basically, welfare state policies, when they are generous, they prevent people from voting for the far right. And we did this very recently. This is a project, this is one of the latest projects that I have been working on. And what we did here is we tried to identify, because a lot of the discussion is about, okay, the unemployed vote for the far right, but part of the reason, as I said earlier, why we know it's a cultural story is because it's not just those at the lower social strata that vote for the far right. It can also be middle classes. It can also be, and we said, okay, but this doesn't mean that they're not social risk groups, right? There are social risk groups in middle class people. There are more higher educated people that are also part of a risk group. So here I've done this typology where basically we have distinguished between different types of people that face social risks and the type of policy that corresponds to them. So for the pensioners is, do you have a generous pension? These are people, they're not necessarily at the total lower strata, but these are people who have paid in the system all their lives, and now they don't have an income, and they are concerned, and they're angry at the system, right? And if your pension, I know this for a fact because I lived it in Greece with the economic crisis, how pensions were cut from people who had been paying in, from older people who had been relying on this to come in at the end of their lives. And then a lot of these people actually went and voted for anti-establishment, precisely because they were really angry that what they thought belonged to them was taken away from them. So you have a different types of groups, people with large families, permanent workers who want some stability, who just don't want to be fired or dismissed really easily, permanently sick or disabled people that expect some support from the state. So it's all about the social contract. And we found, I'm not going to bore you with more data, but just to stop here, basically, I mean, this is just on the unemployment and the pension, but we found a similar story for all. Actually, supportive policies, and these are not just policies giving benefits. We're not just talking about benefits, right? We're talking about protection legislation, right? Employment protection legislation, or kind of legislation that makes you feel secure in whatever position you're in. These kinds of policies tend to lower the propensity of individuals voting for the far right across different Western European countries. So, in other words, because there are people who are insecure or discontent, or because there are people who don't like immigrants or whatever, this doesn't tell us that there will be necessarily support for these kinds of groups. There's something that happens in the middle. So we have agency. There is something that governments, and there is something that we as societies can do to stop this phenomenon, which is not just simply by saying we'll just adopt all their policies and become a milder version of them. So just to conclude, because I do believe that, Sabine, am I right? I'm at 7:15, so I think I've talked for a long time. So I know there was a lot of information, and I hope it wasn't too much to take in, but I was asked to do the simple task here today of trying to conceptualize how I understand the relationship between populism, nationalism, and identity. And essentially, I did it by looking at 3 different levels. My argument was that at the demand side, at the people side, it's not about, or it's not just about nationalism, and it's not just about identity. It's not even about populism. It's about the multiple grievances that drive people to punish the establishment or the mainstream. At the supply side, or at the party level, nationalism matters because through it, and specifically through civic nationalism, these parties have found a winning strategy. They have found a winning formula that allows them to capture precisely support from these diverse social groups that vote for them. But there is something that we can actually do about it. And that's not just saying, right, we'll just all become anti-immigrant and that'll be the end of it, but rather it is to tackle the underlying insecurities that drive people to vote for far-right populists for different reasons. And I think the answer in that is to try to address inequality, and to try to address inequality of the many, not of the few, not just of the lower strata, but of broader society, by implementing specific welfare state policies that mitigate different social risks. And I'm going to stop here.